All right, welcome to our viewers. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today. Tape doesn't measure up. Today's data protection needs, tape versus object storage. Joining us today are Amit Railani, Director of Alliances here at Cloudian, as well as David Phillips, Principal Architect of M&E Solutions at Cloudian. With that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to Amit.
Thank you, Audrey. Hello and welcome, everybody. The topic for discussion today we have here is tape. Does it measure up? We're going to discuss tape storage medium and some of the applications for it. Where does tape actually fit in today's landscape? How does it compare in terms of object storage? And what are some of the things that you should be considering when you're looking at modernizing your data center? With me, I have today David Phillips, who is an expert in everything in media and entertainment business. He comes from the media and entertainment industry, having worked there for multiple years, and is very, very intimately familiar with tape as well as object storage technology. This particular topic is particularly relevant because of the times that we live in. What a strange last 6 months it has been. If you're anything like me, you're still working from home. You haven't seen a lot of office time in the last 6 months, and who knows how long this may last. So how does this impact your day-to-day schedule as well as your work activity? So we'll get into some of these topics, and we will discuss everything that impacts our day-to-day work life, as well as how modernizing your data center will be of use, not just to you, but to your business as well. With that, I'm going to bring in David. And David, first of all, welcome. And why don't we begin by quickly talking a little bit about the current state of affairs? Can we just get into a little bit of the technology of tape media and some of the current scenarios that we may want to discuss on tape?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Amit. So, yeah, we, kind of at a lot of the customers that we talk to, really find themselves at a crossroads, over the last, 9 to 12 months, certainly, but, certainly in the last 6 months with, changes in business operations. So, data tape has traditionally been that, tier 3, tier 4, depending on how you categorize it, storage class used for an economical, scalable way to offload data, unstructured data and assets from primary storage, tier 1, SAN and NAS. So, a way, being that the tier 1 class of storage, your SAN and NAS, is highly performant. It's also, the most expensive class of storage, with the highest cost per terabyte. So, data tape kind of fits into that, into the total storage infrastructure as a way to, offload, data, from the expensive tier 1 primary storage. So, it's, been in development for decades, and current, format generations, every 2 to 3 years, they come out with the vendor certification, standardization body comes out with a new tape format that increases the data density and potentially increases the speed for reads and writes. So we're currently at LTO-8 generation. So, you have customers, that out in the field that are in the middle of migrating from their, potentially migrating from their LTO 5 and 6 or 7, to a new generation of 8. And so that's a key part of the, one of the factors in managing data tape is that you have every 3 to 5 years you have to undergo a tape format migration, because every tape format generation up to LTO7, you would be able to write and read that generation tape format and then read back 2 generations. With LTO8, they kind of made a break with that so that LTO8 only reads back 1 generation to LTO7. So it puts a little bit more urgency on enterprises that are using data tape, for large, data storage, in that they effectively, once those LTO8 devices become end of life, they would not be able to read back. They would need to completely migrate not only their tape hardware infrastructure but their data tape sets. So as far as use cases for tape, as we described, it's essentially kind of like offloading data from primary storage. So it's really in that kind of backup and archive space. If you have finalized media assets, you're archiving those for kind of long-term preservation, and for day-to-day operations, you're backing up your tier 1 NAS in case of any kind of outage or the catastrophic failure. So, being the backup and archive are 2 separate operations. You might even have like a separate backup partition on your tape library and then a separate archive for finalized, long-term assets. So that's, really kind of like the state of data tape today. And there's a lot of, compelling use cases for tape. The economics, that we discussed, as far as the low cost per gigabyte, that it enables storing. And there's also, a kind of best practices aspect to it, where there's a principle of data storage, data protection best practice that describes, a principle of, kind of be considered the 3-2-1 principle, where for proper data protection for valuable, data, you should have 3 instances of every data asset or media asset, and it should be stored on at least 2 technologies, and at least one of those instances should be off-site, separated from the primary repository. So, there's a lot of companies that use object storage, as their kind of primary active archive, for the fast speeds of archive and restore, and then they create another instance on data tape, as providing these kind of best practices for data protection.
That's great, David. So if we synthesize that from a use case perspective, there's still relevant and good use cases that tape is a good media for. And being an offline storage, there's still definitely that low cost tier that it can service as, and it's one of the chosen methodology for a lot of our customer base as well.
Yeah.
So if we get into some of the challenges that we want to talk about with tape, right? What are some of the use cases that tape has traditionally been used for? We talked about just the basic backup and archive, but what are the challenges that all of us who've worked, if any of us who work with tape, we all have a love-hate relationship with tape. So what are those challenges? What are those drawbacks that we see more and more of our customers not wanting to deal with and wanting a solution for?
Right. Yeah, and that's really become that a lot of those topics of conversation have really come to the forefront in the last months. Prior even to the current time period, like data tape has always had a drawback of accessibility, in that it's essentially an offline data storage medium, right? So there's 10 years ago, if you were doing a kind of, a video edit, you might have media in a timeline, and you had clips that were kind of local on your local short storage or your shared storage, and then you'd have clips that's like, and you'd have a little icon pop up in your editor that said media offline. It's like, okay, well, we got to go and restore that from the archive, potentially. So, we're living in a world now where like the expectation has quickly become all media is online and accessible all the time, so this kind of offline, modality where not only is, tapes aren't loaded onto primary store, data is not loaded onto primary storage. It has to be accessed from a tape library slot, and then robot has to go and grab that tape, put it into the drive, then start spooling it to the primary storage. It's what a lot of organizations rely on day to day currently, but they're quickly kind of running into the limits of the speed of managing, large archives. So accessibility, is a key thing, especially if in the case of you have a whole tape set that has been, sent off-site to like either a warehouse, an off-site storage facility such as Iron Mountain. If you have tape failures in your tape library or in your, you have either the tape media, has a mechanical problem, you drop a tape, or, there's something with the tape medium itself, ends up becoming kind of broken or something like that. You have to retrieve the offline, you have to, recall the tape set from the offsite storage facility, which, that could be, best case scenario, 24-hour turnaround time, but it could be, 72 hours or longer, and then kind of loading it into the tape library. File format migrations is something we discussed, earlier about this constant migration, every 3 to 5 years, which, it can be a very painful, long process. I've talked to customers who have media archives in the petabyte level, tens of petabytes, and they're in the process of going from LTO 5 to LTO 7, and they're 3 to 5 years, 3.5 years into this process because they have to manage their day-to-day operations of archives and restores. And all of this tape migration is a background process that has to take a back seat. Otherwise, it would interrupt their kind of production needs and business operations. So they also report that, in the time of COVID, where they're really leaning on their archive heavily, they now have to completely pause the tape migration, and now it's going to push it out even farther. So, but, offline tape media sets, essentially, this issues of accessibility, mechanical failures with the tape library robotics or the tape media cartridges themselves, are all drawbacks that media managers and storage managers tend to run into when managing large tape libraries.
And in COVID times, isn't that accentuated? Because in a lot of cases, you have administrators who, at least in the first few months, have not been able to get into colos where you had restrictions of entry and so on and so forth. So having this requirement for physical access or mechanical access that may or may not work definitely poses certain challenges, which are accentuated in our in the world that we live in. I do want to bring in one more flavor to this, and that is a use case that tape has typically been looked at as a good solution for, and I want to discuss on what your thoughts are on that. So this is ransomware and ransomware protection. I mean, if you've not been living under a rock, you've probably heard the news and read about all those attacks, from small mom and pop shops to multinational banks and entertainment houses that got attacked by malware, where the entire data libraries were encrypted, and the bad actors basically demanded ransom in terms of bitcoins to kind of open up the data back to getting the business online. Now, in a lot of cases, I've seen some of the people say, "But hey, we have tape backups, so we could potentially bring these back online and not have to pay for these ransom demands." So, David, what's your thought on tape being a good ransomware protection technology, so to speak?
Yeah, and I think, and that's key part of why putting this air gap label on this slide is that a lot of times when people talk about data protection as a function of security, and security against intrusion, hackers, and as you're describing ransomware, a lot of people will say like the most secure solution is an air gapped solution where you literally it's not on the network, or it's essentially a tape set on the shelf is the only real is the most secure storage you can have against these security intrusions or ransomware. And while that may be true, there's also just the flip side of it is, if you cannot restore your data in a reasonable amount of time to even check the integrity of the data,
right,
you don't even have the assurance that you actually have the data you think you have. And that's, I think, it's another aspect of data tape and its offline nature, is that you don't know what data you have and what data is viable until you restore it to primary storage, spinning disk, some sort of online storage platform. So you have a case where if you have a multi-petabyte archive or backup, and it could be into the tens of petabytes, and your ransomware hackers have given you a 48-hour deadline,
right,
to provide ransom, or they will essentially destroy all your data forever, then you are now under the gun to verify that all of your offline data tape backups are viable, and that there's you could have essentially tape problems. You could have it's not uncommon to have a tape load into the tape drive, and then it says error, can't read tape. And so then you have to go and retrieve the off-site copy of the tape, which again, when the clock is ticking on 48 hours, it's sometimes unfeasible to even, verify the data that you have.
And I'm sure that's the reason why we see a lot of the attackees or the people who get attacked end up paying so much ransom. In fact, from what we've seen in the past year or so, we've seen ransomware attacks becoming the top 5 risks to the world economy. Now, this was according to the Davos World Economic Forum in 2019. More than 4,000 attacks per day, according to US FBI. And about 51% of the companies ended up paying ransom. Now, all of this comes down to obviously a mix of people not even having a solution, or even if people have solutions, there's not enough time for them to verify if they can actually retrieve and avoid paying ransom. So what we see is a lot of these enterprise customers or even the mom and pop shop end up paying ransom, and it's become almost an $8 billion cost to businesses. This is as of 2018, and what we've seen also with the COVID times, the coronavirus has become a clickbait for even more attacks. So who knows how much that's going to impact business. on top of all the disruption that we've had. So, in short, tape media, though it had been a good solution or one of the solutions for attacks, specifically for ransomware attack, where you have a timed window to respond, it doesn't sound like it's the right approach. And just following on to that, right? So let's talk about some of the ways that we can actually modernize our data centers so that we can avoid not just these ransomware kind of situations, but in general, right? What most of the customers are saying is cloud storage is the future. You can actually go to the cloud for anything and everything. Let's talk a little bit about what the cloud means. Is it all public cloud? Is it a mix of hybrid on-prem, off-site, public cloud kind of situation? So let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And, just in quickly touching on, what are some of the drivers for people moving to cloud storage, be it private or public? I think this kind of, we've been talking about kind of the, just what it requires to set up, maintain, and support a tape data storage, solution. And I think, this slide, people talked about, they really kind of just focused on tape is cheap. I can buy a tape cartridge, or a set of tape cartridges, for, very low cost per gigabyte. But oftentimes what they're not really kind of taking into account is all the infrastructure and technology and just human manual operations that requires to manage, taking advantage of that tape cartridge. And I think this slide kind of spotlights the complexity of, of a data tape, where you have some sort of, backup or archive platform, that's running on, for high availability and throughput, is running on multiple servers, and is communicating to the tape library over a fiber channel fabric, which could be really a dedicated, it's the only fiber channel fabric in the infrastructure because it's required for accessing the tape drives. And you also have to have some sort of, shared storage space for staging archives and a restore point from the library. So, even though it's this offline medium, you need some space in order to restore to stage archives and restore to. So it kind of adds up both in, economic, costs on a CapEx and OpEx basis, but also just on the kind of the engineering cost of the engineering overhead of managing, this complex infrastructure and managing physical tape media. So contrast that with, object storage, where you can really simplify this infrastructure. You can, use an existing 10 gig network and do the same kinds of, tiering, offload from primary storage to scalable, cost, effective object storage over existing Ethernet, fabrics. And because it's an S3, based API-based storage pool, you technically don't even need all those specialized, backup and archive platforms and, fiber channel fabric and everything like that. It's just online and accessible over your Ethernet network. But so, to your point, to your question, Amit, digital transformation, I feel like we talked about like all these enterprises at a crossroads of what do we do with our legacy data tape, infrastructure? Do we migrate to the next format? LTO9 format is coming out at the end of 2020, or do we pivot and really kind of adopt cloud technologies and cloud methodologies, as our going forward, this is going to be our next generation, storage domain for unstructured data. And so when we talk about cloud, cloud really just represents an abstraction of the underlying resources, and using all of these kinds of web scale technologies like global server load balancers to route around failure and availability to multiple redundant instances of infrastructure and instances of data. So in this diagram, we kind of see that, we can have a private cloud, based on Cloudy and Hyperstore in a data center. So it's a cluster of storage nodes in data center A, and we can have a completely separate cluster of storage nodes in a separate data center. It could be on the same campus, or it could be, like in a kind of separated in a metro area, or it could be across, across the continent. That's one of the benefits of, API, HTTP-based cloud storage, is that it really abstracts where the data is and really can, provide a single namespace for very geographically distributed data sets, including, in this case, in this diagram, a hybrid deployment where it's actually tiering data from the on-prem data centers to a public cloud service for providing just that kind of 3-2-1 data protection best practice of, I have an offsite copy on a separate technology, and that public cloud service could actually be something like AWS Glacier, which is effectively tape storage managed by a public cloud vendor at an offsite location. So I think with the drivers from towards digital transformation and adopting cloud strategies, is the differences here between data tape and cloud storage, as it relates to like object storage as the backing for a lot of cloud infrastructure and operations, is that it's always online and it's accessible everywhere, right? So using HTTPS, protocol, you have a secure encrypted link across the wide area network, which is something that data tape libraries, you really, you don't have the same like online accessibility. Right. And it's even differentiated from an on-prem SAN or NAS storage, which, requires, essentially it requires a local area network connection. Now, in times of COVID, people are not able to get into the office, so they lean on VPN connections, they're working from home or working at, remote sites, and they're trying to access the central data center. What a lot of enterprises are finding is that, number one, SMB, CIFs, NFS are not, they're not very happy, with operating over a wide area network. And even if it's you have a VPN connection, if your local ISP, has, limited bandwidth, or has some kind of like packet loss, tends to kind of drop out, then, these NFS and CIF mounts, don't really like that and are not very happy with that. Also, enterprises are finding that their VPN infrastructure was not designed for the entire company to be, or a large number of their employees accessing the VPN simultaneously. It was really designed for, administrators and, key personnel to be able to access the data center infrastructure from anywhere, not necessarily to do 9-to-5 day-to-day operations, or everybody on the VPN simultaneously.
That's great. So one more thing that I think we should talk about, especially with the S3 APIs that we have been talking about. Do you want to talk a little bit about the object lock, which again, with me coming back to making data immutability a key aspect of what tape used to bring? How does the S3 API enable that?
Yeah, coming back around to the discussion of ransomware and the advantages, say, of an air-gap solution like data tape. I think the cloud vendor space has really responded to that need with S3 object lock functionality, and this is something that kind of came out of AWS as a way to provide an immutable data storage solution for a number of uses. It could be governmental compliance. It could be legal documents that have to essentially have a categorically be immutable, because they are, like sensitive legal information, and, so all these different use cases for having immutable data storage. Ransomware, is yet another use for, a secure, independently validated, like immutable storage solution. And S3 Object Lock provides that by you can create a bucket on Cloudy and Hyperstore, configure it as an object lock bucket, and then everything that's written to that bucket is essentially write once, read many. Worm, it's category storage. It's immutable for a certain period of time that's set by the storage administrator. It could be a set number of months, or it could be even years, right? So it's literally physically impossible to delete, encrypt, to modify that data that's stored in that via that S3 Object Lock API, and including so it's essentially, but it's still online, accessible to be read, from the storage cluster. So, the key difference here is you have the data protection against something like ransomware, but your data is online and accessible. So this can, extend to, multi-petabyte backup and archive sets.
That's very interesting. And of course, given that this is on this particular kind of storage would be on the S3 API accessibility set versus your primary storage would be typically SMB sys, you're really getting a logical air gapping effect similar to what you would get with an offline storage like tape. But in this case, it still is online, but you're really, separating the access mechanism for these two media. So right. Definitely a pretty cool way of solving a sticky problem. So I think with that, any parting thoughts on what we want to leave our audience with today?
Yeah, I think it's kind of a quick overview and survey of kind of some of the different aspects of essentially this, what we call a category of, we consider object storage secondary storage. You're always going to have your primary storage, your needs for primary storage, where you have high performance, low latency, and for things like databases, VM backing stores, data stores for all of your virtualization, and as well as in the media space for all of those real-time operations like real-time ingest, real-time playback, high-speed transcoding, and things like that, video editing. So you're always going to need, that primary storage. But what increasingly we're finding is that, enterprises are really looking to right-size their storage budget and their storage allocations. And, there's really a case to be made for kind of trimming down that primary storage to, say, 20% of your total storage allocations, And then everything else, all of the unstructured data, all the finalized finished assets, all the backups of all of your, projects, as well as your VM virtualization, infrastructure. All of those backups and archives can go to secondary storage, and on-prem object storage provides a great scalable solution, scalable, cost-effective solution for all of that unstructured data and all of those backup and archive of those assets, as well as being, having the flexibility of, I need to scale it. We're running out of space. I can just add nodes to my cluster, and it is automatically, that capacity is available without having to take, maintenance windows and have operations be offline. It's I can just, as the storage pool is up and running, I can add and increase the capacity or replace failed hardware in the background. So really all these kind of capabilities that are driving people towards, kind of modernizing their data storage and infrastructure, and things that data tape is really ill-suited to meet the needs of.
That we conclude our presentation. That was an excellent overview and very good fine points that everybody should consider when modernizing their data centers. Tape has served the needs for large-scale data storage for a long time, but given the challenges, given the drawbacks, and given the technology of what is available today, there's really an imperative to look at storage technology and how it's evolved to create better solutions for your large-scale capacity needs at a better TCO point. And I think that was a great presentation. So we will conclude with that, and I'm going to pass the ball back to Audrey. Audrey, do you have any questions from the audience for David?
I do. All right, awesome. So we do have some time for questions. So for our first question, it is Cloudian object storage comparable to the cost of data tape solutions?
Yeah, that's, it's a common question. It's really been kind of like a focus of Cloudian as a company releasing product was to really go after the kind of, to be a cost-effective, not only scalable, performant platform, but actually to be cost-effective. And we, a big part of that is being a software-defined storage platform that can run on, in essentially any x86 hardware. So, that choice of hardware, really, and not being locked into to just one vendor, hardware solution, really kind of allows us to kind of to keep the cost down and bring it, make a very cost competitive total solution. So, I think we kind of touched on a little bit earlier of like some of the hidden costs of tape, of that it's not just the cost per gigabyte of, buying tape cartridges, but, the annual support contracts for a tape library and the fiber channel fabric switching and, the kind of NAS, storage scratch space that's used to supplement tape library. All the different parts and just, in the engineering overhead of like, it literally takes, almost 2x the engineering overhead to manage a data tape infrastructure as it does to manage, an object storage cluster, which is essentially fairly self-managing and self-healing. A lot of customers just set up storage buckets and then, don't really kind of do a lot of modifications to the system until they need to expand. So, it all depends on the scale of the data sets that you're talking about. But, I think there's even a link to some collateral where we have some TCO reports on when you look at all the hidden factors of tape, that object storage solutions like Cloudy and Hyperstore are actually quite competitive to a data tape solution. So check the links for collateral to a TCO report on that.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that, David. We'll move right into our next question here. Does Cloudian data need to be migrated when storage hardware is updated?
It does not, in the sense that, if you are, updating, refreshing hardware, as hardware, after 5 to 6 years becomes kind of end of life, end of support, then essentially replacing that hardware server starts a background operation of migrating all of that user data to the new hardware sets. So it's very different than, an enterprise SAN or NAS solution, where when you replace the hardware, you essentially have to offload all of that data. It's like a forklift operation where, you have to install the new platform and then essentially do a data migration, which, if you're talking about in order to have access to that data, you have to do a wholesale data migration, which, when it measures into the petabytes, can take a long time and be a very kind of arduous process. So, it goes back to the advantages of being a software-defined storage platform, where the storage service is abstracted somewhat from the underlying hardware, and allows us to be very flexible and very scalable with upgrades, expansions, and migrations.
Great.
I hope
Looks
that
like we have.
question.
Yeah, that was great. Thanks for that as well. Looks like we have just one more question, and that is, what are the scale limits of a Cloudian cluster?
Yeah, we've and it's a good question, and we've actually been kind of really making concerted focus and effort in our software development in the last 12 months to really kind of not only harden the security of our platform, for things like, ransomware and, governmental compliance and security standards, but also really kind of validate it as, a really exabyte scalable solution. So, once you get to, 999 petabytes, what storage platforms out there can really scale to the next level of storing exabytes of data? And, our foundations of having a highly scalable database, distributed database solution built around Cassandra, enables us, and using also the same kind of architectural designs that AWS uses for their S3 storage service, where, we have the concept of like nodes in a cluster that are in a rack in a data center, and then data centers are in a region. All those kinds of architectural design principles around availability zones and, atomic components forming to, a larger storage cluster. We've really kind of tested and focused being able to really scale that exabyte level. So we typically say we don't really have effective scale limits. We've tested, thousands of nodes in a cluster, up to that, that kind of, hundreds of petabytes level. But, we talk about effectively not having any limits. What's our official, some of our official numbers on our scalability limits?
Well, we technically do not have any scale limits, so we do say we're infinitely scalable. But typically what we have is what we see in deployment today. So in deployment, we have customers that have Cloudian clusters running in the 200 to 300 petabyte range. In the labs, we've gone even more than that. But technically, there is no limitation for the scale, and you can definitely say this is an exabyte scalable platform.
Excellent. I'll go with that. Any other questions, Audrey?
I think that's it for today. Thank you both for the informative presentation. That was great, and thanks so much for our audience for joining as well today.